He was already dying in the freezing snow, abandoned, betrayed, left with nothing but his last breath, and she had nothing either, no food, no strength, no reason to stop it. She, a starving nurse, chose to save a man the world had already forgotten him through a brutal storm, risking her own life for a stranger. Thought she was saving a dying cowboy, had no idea. Was one of the most powerful men in the West, and the moment he opened his eyes, everything changed, because the man she saved would soon make her his entire world. The wind howled across the frozen plains like a wounded beast, dragging its last breath through the endless white silence, and in the heart of that merciless storm moved a lone figure, fragile yet unbroken. Her name was Alara Vance, a nurse once trained in the crowded halls of a distant city, now reduced to wandering the Wild West with nothing but a tattered satchel and a fading will to survive. Hunger clawed at her ribs like a persistent animal, and the cold had long since stopped asking permission. It lived in her bones now, as if it had claimed her as its own. She had not eaten in 2 days, and the last coin she carried had been traded for a crust of bread that now existed only as a memory. Her boots were worn thin, her fingers numb, yet she kept moving, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant death. The storm grew heavier, the sky blending into the earth, until there was no horizon, no direction, no promise of tomorrow, only survival. In its rawest form, thin through the veil of snow, she saw something dark against the white, a shape unnatural and still. At first, she thought it was a fallen tree or a trick of her starving mind, but as she drew closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was a man who lay half buried in snow, his body still as death, his coat heavy with frost, his face pale, but not lifeless. Alara dropped to her knees beside him, her instincts overpowering her exhaustion. She pressed trembling fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse, and there it was, faint, but stubborn like a fire, refusing to die. "You are not gone yet," she whispered, though her voice was lost to the wind. The man was large, broad-shouldered. Even in his weakened state, his clothes spoke of wealth. Fine leather, thick wool boots, crafted not for wandering, but for command. A silver star pinned to his coat hinted at authority, or perhaps legend. But none of that mattered now to Alara. He was a life hanging by a thread, and she was the last hand, holding it with strength she did not know she still possessed. She dragged him inch by inch through the snow, her body screaming in protest, every step a battle, every breath a struggle, until she found shelter, a broken-down cabin half swallowed by the storm, its roof barely holding its walls, groaning under the weight of winter. But it was off inside. The darkness wrapped around them like a second storm, but it was warmer than the outside, and that was all that mattered. Alara laid the man near what remained of a fireplace, her fingers fumbling as she gathered scraps of wood, and with shaking hands she coaxed a small fire into existence, its weak glow pushing back the shadows. Removed his coat, her breath catching again at the sight of blood frozen against his shirt. A wound deep and angry, someone had tried to end him, and nearly succeeded. "Stay with me," she murmured, as she worked tearing strips from her own clothing to clean and bind the wound. Her hands were steady despite her weakness, guided by training, by instinct, by something deeper than reason. Hours passed, or perhaps it was minutes. Time blurred into the rhythm of survival. The fire crackled softly, and the storm raged on outside like a world trying to erase them both. Finally, the man stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes flickered open, dark, intense. Even in confusion, "Where am I?" he rasped. "Safe for now," Alara replied, though she was not sure if it was truth or hope. He studied her, his gaze sharp despite his condition. "You saved me, kept you alive," she corrected. "There is a difference." A faint smile touched his lips before pain pulled it away. "My name is Rowan Haley." Alara nodded. Alara Vance. Their eyes met in the dim firelight. To strangers bound by circumstance, by survival, by something neither could yet name. "You should have left me," Rowan said after a moment, his voice quieter. "No." Alara shook her head. "No one deserves to die alone in the snow." Closed his eyes as if her words carried a weight heavier than his. "Wound, then I owe you my life." Ash did not answer, because she knew life was not something easily repaid. Outside, the storm continued, But inside something had changed, something fragile had taken root. Not yet trust, not yet connection, but the beginning of something that would grow stronger than the cold, stronger than the hunger, stronger than the past. That chased them both across the unforgiving land, and neither of them knew that this moment, this fragile flicker of survival, would become the fire that would change everything. The storm had passed, but the world it left behind was no kinder. The snow stretched endlessly beneath a pale sun that offered light without warmth, and inside the broken cabin life continued to cling on by fragile threads. Alara Vance moved like a shadow between exhaustion and determination, her body weakened by hunger, yet driven by something stronger than survival alone. Rowan Hale lay near the fire, no longer a stranger, no longer just a life she had saved, but a presence that filled the silence between heartbeats. Days passed in a quiet rhythm of struggle and healing. Alara rationed what little she could find, melting snow for water, searching the edges of the frozen land for anything that might keep them alive. Roots, scraps, anything forgotten by the world. She always returned with something small, something barely enough, but enough to keep the flame burning both in the fire and in them. Rowan grew stronger, slowly, painfully, each movement a reminder of how close he had come to death, yet his eyes never lost their sharpness, the kind that had seen too much and trusted too little. He watched Alara, often not with suspicion, but with something quieter, something that grew with each passing day. "You should have taken what I had and left me," he said one morning, his voice steadier now. Alara did not look at him as she stirred the weak broth she had made. "There was nothing worth taking except a life, and I chose to keep that." Rowan studied her words, settling deep inside him like seeds in frozen ground most people would not have. "Most people are not starving nurses wandering through storms," she replied softly as silence followed, not empty, but full of unspoken truths of pasts that neither had shared, yet both carried like invisible scars. One evening, as the sun sank into a horizon of silver and blue, Rowan finally stood, his legs unsteady, but his will unbroken. Alara rushed to his side instinctively, her hands ready to catch him if he fell. But he did not fall. Instead, he steadied himself with a deep breath. "I have to go back," he said, "back to what Alara asked, to everything that tried to kill me." His words were not spoken with anger, but with certainty, and that was far more dangerous. "You are not ready," she said firmly. He turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "I have been ready since the moment they left me to die." Alara felt something shift inside her, fear, not for herself, but for him, for the path he was already walking in his mind. "Then at least wait until you can stand without shaking." A faint smile touched his lips again. That same quiet, almost broken smile. "You sound like you plan to keep me alive a little longer." She met his eyes without hesitation. "I did not bring you back from death just to watch you walk into it again." Something passed between them, then something deeper than words, something that neither of them could deny anymore. The next days were different, no longer just survival, but preparation. Rowan regained his strength piece by piece, his movements growing sure, his presence stronger. And Alara remained beside him, not because she had to, but because leaving no longer felt possible. When the day finally came, the sky was clear, the snow untouched, and the world felt still, as if waiting. Rowan stepped outside the cabin, his coat wrapped tightly around him, his wound no longer bleeding, but not forgotten. Alara followed, her breath visible in the cold air. "You do not have to come," he said without turning. "I know," she replied, "but you will anyway." "Yes." He looked at her, then really looked at her, not as the woman who had saved him, but as the woman who had chosen to stay, then stay close. He said quietly, "Their journey across the snow was long and unforgiving, but this time Alara was not alone, and Rowan was no longer a man left for dead." Together they moved forward toward a past that refused to stay buried. They reached the town by nightfall, a place carved into the wilderness, rough, loud, alive with danger and opportunity, the kind of place where power was taken, not given. And Rowan Hale had once been the man who held it all. Whispers followed them as they walked through the streets, eyes widened, doors creaked open and shut. His return was not unnoticed. It was a ghost walking back into a life that had already buried him inside the largest building. At the center of the town waited the men who had betrayed him, led by a man named Corvin Drake, a name spoken with fear and respect. When Rowan stepped through the doors, the room fell silent. Every eye turned, every breath held. "You should be dead," Corvin said, his voice smooth but tight with disbelief. "And yet here I am," Rowan replied calmly. Corvin laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Seems the snow was not enough." "No, but she was," Rowan said, and for the first time every eye turned to Alara. She stood still, her presence quiet yet unyielding, and in that moment, she was no longer just a starving nurse. She was the reason a legend had returned. What followed was not chaos, but something colder, something controlled. Words were exchanged, truths revealed. And when it ended quickly. Rowan reclaimed what had been taken, not with cruelty but with finality. The past settled, the betrayal answered, but it was what came after that changed everything. In the days that followed, Rowan did not return to the man he had been before. Something in him had shifted, something shaped by a woman who had chosen compassion over survival. He built something new, not just power, but purpose. The town changed slowly, becoming a place where strength did not mean cruelty, and survival did not demand sacrifice of the soul. And at the center of it all was Alara, no longer wandering, no longer starving. She had found something she had not known. She was searching for. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and fire, Rowan found her standing at the edge of the town, looking out at the endless land. "You could have left at any time," he said. "I know," she answered. "Why did you stay?" She turned to him, her eyes steady. "Because somewhere between saving your life and walking beside you, I realized I was no longer trying to survive, I was living." Rowan stepped closer, the distance between them no longer something either of them needed. "You gave me more than my life," he said quietly. "You gave me something worth living." For Alara smiled, not the fragile smile of before, but something stronger, something certain. "And you gave me a place in a world that had forgotten me." The wind moved gently round them, no longer a force of destruction, but something softer, something that carried the promise of tomorrow. Rowan reached for her hand, and this time she did not hesitate. In a land defined by harshness and loss, they had found something rare, something powerful, something unbreakable. Not just survival, not just love, but a life built together from the cold ashes of everything they had endured. And in the wild, endless West, where stories were often written in blood and thus theirs became one of fire and hope, a starving nurse who healed a dying cowboy until he made her his world, and in doing so found his own again.